Jonathan Lemire, you have reporting this morning about Joe Biden's vice presidential selection, the names he's looking at right now, and those names have certainly been influenced by those candidates have certainly been influenced by the events of the past month. Tell us about it.
There's no question about that, Joe. My colleagues at the AP and other outlets have all had a series of stories in the last few days about this very topic. The process is accelerating. The Biden team has conducted a number of interviews. They're moving on to looking at sort of financial disclosures and personal information. So some of the names that we have all expected. Senator Kamala Harris certainly is right near the top of the list. Senator Elizabeth Warren remains there as well. A few surprises. Tammy Baldwin is in the mix. Val Demings, we know. And certainly to your point, the events of the last few weeks are certainly shaping how the Biden team is looking at this. As you know, the former vice president has pledged to pick a female vice president. There's people around him, Democrats, including Congressman Clyburn, who have said at this moment with the protests, and particularly those in Minnesota, have hurt the chances of Senator Klobuchar. But others, it may be helping them. Val Demings in particular, speaking out in this moment. Susan Rice, former Obama administration official, is another one who has gained momentum in this stretch. And certainly, it can't be overstated how important this pick is. I think traditionally selections of vice presidents tend to be a little bit overrated. Perhaps those of us in the media care more about it than the actual voters who are going to go to the ballot box, who tend to make their choice based on the name at the top rather than the bottom of the ticket. But in this one, with Joe Biden potentially, were he to win, being the oldest president to be elected, as discussed, there are health issues concerning the conversations about both candidates, Biden and Trump. I think there's a real sense here of really needing to sort of solidify this pick, nail this pick, not just for electoral purposes, not just to perhaps gain a state on the map, but also to reassure. This vice president, more than others, is really going to be seen as being one heartbeat away from the top job. And I think that the Biden team knows that, and they're taking it very thoroughly, and they're taking it very seriously as they proceed. Their timetable, probably to make their selection in early August, a few days or weeks before the Democratic convention, whatever shape that convention will take.
Casey, get us updated with your reporting.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there is definitely pressure on the former vice president to select a person, a woman of color, considering what we've seen unfold in the streets in the last several weeks. But I will also say that I think the person to listen to on that question is Jim Clyburn, who really has the ear of the former vice president and who, really guided them through the crucible moment that they had in South Carolina. And he said that it's not a must. That Joe Biden do that. And I think that's part of why you're continuing to see names like Tammy Baldwin pop up in this kind of a search. And, I do think the underlying question that Jonathan Lemire pointed to is a key one. And, one previous example, and the point about, vice presidential picks maybe mattering, maybe not, is entirely fair. But I think the Biden team is looking at what happened to John McCain in 2008 when he selected Sarah Palin. That was another election where there were health questions raised. In some cases it got ugly. And, there's a feeling that he picked somebody that a lot of potentially independent voters weren't willing to trust with the presidency. And, given the landscape that we're looking at here, it's also, I think, an important consideration to think about selecting somebody that doesn't necessarily turn off independent voters, suburban women, the white women you mentioned without college degrees that seem to be breaking this way. So that's kind of the way in which they're grappling with this question right now. So,
Mark Leibovich, you've had Reverend Al Sharpton, who was with us and is going to be with us again. You've had Reverend Al. You've also, of course, had Jim Clyburn, probably the most powerful black voice on Capitol Hill, both saying that Joe Biden's pick did not have to be a black woman. But at the same time, the events of the past several weeks certainly put a far bigger focus on people like Val Demings and Catherine and Harris, Senator Harris, Kamala Harris, as well as people like Susan Rice.
Yeah, I mean, I think what happens in a case like this is people might overrate the power of the moment itself. Now, obviously, events are going to dictate partly how the vice president and his team are going to be thinking about this. But ultimately, when he makes his pick, that pick will be the pick. And whoever, that is, will sort of create their own context, their own reality, and people will, the pick will rise and fall on her merits. And so, look, going forward, I think that will sort of take on a life of its own, and that will sort of climb the pick more so than any moment, in the news. But obviously, right now, I mean, this is an urgent issue in this country, and it's something that a lot of people are pointing to.
Yeah, and Bob Costa, Casey brought up Sarah Palin in 2008. I'm sure Joe Biden's campaign team is going to make sure that whoever they pick is somebody who has been tested, who knows international issues as well as local issues, who understands foreign policy as much as they understand policing. I'm sure they don't want to be blindsided again by a pick that might momentarily excite the base, but cause problems in the long run of the campaign.
And in Susan Rice, Ambassador Rice, you would find someone who had that significant experience on foreign policy, the gravitas in the eyes of many Democrats. And you see in someone like Senator Harris, someone who has not only the Senate experience, but the vetting of a national campaign. She has had reporters like myself and others look at her record. She's been on the campaign trail. You can't undersell the power of experience in a national campaign to deal with the scrutiny of the media and the scrutiny of voters. Just one final note, Senator Baldwin of Wisconsin. I've been covering her for over a decade. She's not just some random senator from Wisconsin. This is someone who's deeply connected. I've been with her in Madison to cover her. The protest politics of Madison, Wisconsin, on racial injustice, on gay rights. And so she is someone, if you're looking to connect with the moment, even though she is a white woman, she has a history of protest movements in her politics. So it's interesting to see her name rise for that reason.
I think the two names, Mika, I've been thinking about for some time, Tammy Baldwin and Gretchen Whitmer as well.
Absolutely.
Along with the other women we brought up for possible VP candidates. Tammy Baldwin, because she knows Wisconsin very well and will be a very good contrast. And you'll have two Midwesterners in Joe Biden with his Pennsylvania background and Tammy Baldwin with her background in Wisconsin. Also Gretchen Whitmer, who, of course, came to the forefront of the national scene during the coronavirus crisis. Her approval ratings extremely well, much better than Donald Trump's. That could help lock down a state like Michigan.
I can think of so many great choices, which is a great position to be in and great for women. Bob Costa, thank you. Mark Leibovich, thank you as well. And still ahead, a look at emerging coronavirus hotspots in the U.S. as fears of a second wave of infections is becoming a reality for many parts of the country. We'll go live to NBC's Vaughn Hilliard in Seattle for his reporting on what's going on in that city with the ongoing protests as well. Morning Joe is coming right back.
Thanks for checking out MSNBC on YouTube, and make sure you subscribe to stay up to date on the day's biggest stories. And you can click on any of the videos around us to watch more from Morning Joe and MSNBC. Thanks so much for watching.